Okay, folks, we're about to start the next session with our keynote. Can I ask you all to have a seat? Okay, I'm David Jefferson, and I'm here to introduce today's keynote speaker, former California Secretary of State Kevin Shelley. And to do that, I need to take a few minutes to give you some context and to illustrate the enormous significance of his contributions to voting system security. Concern about voting technology and security didn't begin with the 2020 election or even the 2016 election. It goes back over 2 decades to at least 2003 with the first introduction of computerized voting machines widely in the United States. At that time, jurisdictions all over the country were purchasing electronic touchscreen voting machines known as direct recording electronic devices, or DREs. Now, with a DRE, a voter would indicate their vote choices on a large touchscreen, and those votes would be stored internally on a removable memory card. And at the end of the day, all of the cards from the entire jurisdiction would be brought to a central location and read by the election management computer, which tallied all of the votes. With DREs, the election process from beginning to end was entirely paperless. We have examples of DREs out there in the next room for you to look at, including 3 instances of the Dill TSX voting machine, which will feature later in this talk and in the movie I'm going to show you. It's an infamous machine. Machines like the Dill TSX, other DREs, had enormous appeal. Election officials, in particular, loved them because they appeared to eliminate the massive logistical nightmare of dealing with literally tons of paper ballots or transporting dozens or hundreds of 500-pound metal lever machines that you may not even remember. All electronic elections seemed to be clean, fast, economical, accurate, and unquestionable. One man, however, Stanford computer science professor David Dill, saw a profound danger in these machines. He was concerned that the electronic ballots cast on DREs were actually completely invisible to the voters and to the poll workers and to the election officials and to the public that was supposed to be able to observe the canvas. And the software in these machines was proprietary and not available for anyone to examine. The electronic ballots could be easily manipulated undetectably by either buggy or misconfigured or malicious software or by unscrupulous human insiders with little chance of detection. DREs made the whole election process essentially unauditable in any meaningful way. David Dill, Professor Dill, traveled to Sacramento to take his concerns to then Secretary of State Kevin Shelley. As the chief election officer in the largest state in the Union, he was arguably the most important election official in the United States at that time. The fact that he even agreed to see Professor Dill under the circumstances is unusual, but he took the meeting. And that fateful meeting, in my view, marks the beginning of the end of DREs in the United States and the start of a revolution in our thinking about how voting systems and election security should be conducted that continues today. Kevin Shelley, is the one who started the processes that, among other things, eventually led to the founding of this voting village. Shelley's response to Dill's concerns was first to study the issues himself and then to appoint a task force to make recommendations to him. 3 of us on the task force, David Dill, Kim Alexander, and myself, were a small minority who pushed to recommend that the state not purchase any more DREs and that it retrofit the ones it had already purchased with printers that were intended at least to allow voters to verify that the DRE recorded their votes accurately. The large majority of the other task force members were totally opposed to these ideas. And in the end, the report we issued to the secretary had to be a compromise and clearly indicated the task force's internal division. But in response...
You're telling half my speech.
No, well, All right, I'll skip ahead then. Come on up. Come on up. This is Secretary Kevin Shelley. I want to show you a 5-minute video clip here that'll capture some of the drama around those times. So pause. See if I can make this run the first time.
The new battleground was California, the center of the computer industry, and the Secretary of State, Kevin Shelley, was getting worried about security.
Well, in 2003, Kevin Shelley discovered that one of the counties was running uncertified software, and so he ordered an audit of all of the county's voting machines in California, and he discovered that none of them were using certified software.
They later even acknowledged that they were aware of the law, but even though they were aware of the law, they chose to ignore it, and they made those changes without seeking prior approval, which is a direct violation of state law. That's when I first came to realize Diebold's lack of integrity as a company.
Diebold was called to account by the state of California. At stake was millions of dollars worth of business, and Diebold was forced to put their president, Bob Urosevich, on the stand.
As you know, about a year ago, one version of the source code of the Diebold TSX system escaped your control, and some months later was investigated by a group headed by Professor Avi Rubin of Johns Hopkins University, and they wrote a report which found numerous severe vulnerabilities in the code that they saw. I would like your general reaction to those reports before we go a little more deeply.
Basically, the code was stolen. In there is passwords. In there is our encryption technology. Okay, now, I'm not a rocket science, but let me tell you, if somebody steals the key to my house, the first thing I'm going to do is probably change the lock. So that's what we went ahead and did.
As you know, the code wasn't stolen. It was left on a public FTP site by your own company.
The code was lifted off of our site, sir, and we still believe it was
downloaded
stolen.
You know that.
Okay.
Now, of course, the source code, in fact, got out. The key is now published. What in effect you did, or your team did, is create a big complex building, put locks on every door, use the same key for every lock, and then published a picture of the key on the wall. This was far below the minimal standards of security.
But for Bev, there was a more basic problem than security. Could Diebold be trusted at all with the counting of the vote?
On topic number one, Diebold, we have a company that lies. Yes, I'll say it, lies. Up here this morning, they were saying they'd made all the changes in the software to fix the multiple flaws that would have never been found in the beginning if I hadn't have found their files on the website, by the way. But, you see, there's something called release notes. It's a legal document. It is something that must show everything you did and did not change when you put out a new version. I obtained the release notes for GEMS. They did not fix any of the problems. This stuff was never corrected. I don't know what to say. How can you have a company say we want secret software that nobody, even the county registrars who are here testifying on their behalf, is allowed to look at? And when you look at it, you find flaws, and then they say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, so you turn it over to scientific panels. They find flaws, they say, oh, don't worry about it, we corrected it, and that's a lie.
Bob Urosevich, Diebold's president, did offer this statement defending Diebold election systems, also known as DESI.
DESI understands that the SOS, the Secretary of State, and the voting panel are disappointed in the fact that the R&G Associates inventory report identified unqualified and uncertified software, and are looking at DESI to acknowledge that this should not have happened. To be clear, there was no improper intent or motive on DESI's part to give rise to this situation. At the outset, I want to be crystal clear that these allegations in this report about Diebold's deceiving are not true and are factually not supported.
A few days later, Kevin Shelley, the Secretary of State of California, announced the consequences for Diebold.
I am decertifying the Diebold TSX system, banning its use in 4 counties where it is installed. Furthermore, I have taken the additional step, and I have the letter here, just signed upstairs, of asking the Attorney General to pursue criminal and civil actions against Diebold in this matter, based on findings of fraudulent actions. We will not tolerate deceitful tactics as engaged in by Diebold. Don't try to pull a fast one on the voters of California, because there will be consequences if you do.
The state brought a civil action against Diebold, but never pursued criminal charges. The lawsuit was eventually settled for a payment by Diebold of $2.6 million.
Okay, I'm not going to give the second half of his speech. So, he took those actions under enormous opposition, which you will now hear about. He took a lot of flack for it. But we're happy to have with us today the man who did the right thing in the face of that enormous opposition and who started a national discussion on voting technology that continues today. We asked him to come here and speak about those events of 20-some years ago, and he happily agreed. So here's the former Secretary of State of California and also the current Vice Chairman of Verified Voting, Kevin Shelley.
Thank you. You know, I haven't been to Vegas in a number of years, and my son Jack is sitting near the front, graciously agreed to join me on this trip. He's 24. Note to self for me is that in my next life, don't wait till you're 46 to have kids. Anyway, I asked ChatGPT, this is true, we're going to Vegas, my son and I, you know, what is there to do? Are there good shows to go to? And I kid you not, ChatGPT came back with, I can't remember the exact words, something along the lines of, well, given the fact that you're 70 and your son is 24, let's try to find a show that would accommodate you both. So they recommended Kelly Clarkson. Now, I have nothing against Ms. Clarkson, but we were looking for a little something more Vegas-like. And the words of ChatGPT were, for someone at your point in life, she will be a good performer for you. So I immediately canceled my subscription to ChatGPT and switched to Claude right after that. The hearing you just watched was in Sacramento in 2004. I want to point out 3 people in it, because 2 of them are the reason we were able to do any of what you just watched. The man asking the questions, where is he? David Jefferson. Diebold's president had just explained that their source code was stolen, and he offered an analogy. If somebody steals the key to my house, the first thing I'd do is change the locks. David let him finish. Then he pointed out that the code hadn't been stolen. Diebold had left it sitting on their own public server. And the president said, we still believe it was stolen. Then David turned the man's own analogy around on him. You put a lock on every door, he said. Then you use the same key for all of them. And then you published a photograph of the key. The president of Diebold chose the analogy. David turned it around on him in about 30 seconds. David was a key figure on our task force and on our voting systems panel, and he is a giant in the field of election integrity, David Jefferson. The woman who said out loud and on the record that this is a company that lies, that's Bev Harris. She's the reason any of this happened. Diebold left his files on a public server, and Bev Harris found them. She was a grandmother in Seattle with no credentials and no institutional standing of any kind. She simply looked. Then she did something better. Diebold testified they had fixed the flaws, so Bev got the release notes, a legal document, which has to record what changed in a version. They hadn't fixed anything. I spoke with her during those years. She had no budget and no title and no obligation to any of it. And she was right before the rest of us were. So that's towards the end of the story. I'd like to take you back to the first hour. In February of 2003, within a month of my taking office as Secretary of State, a man came to see me to report a problem. He had a stack of documents. Oh my God, they were like 2 feet worth. He'd done his homework. He'd been trying for months to get anybody in the state of California to listen to him. And I'll tell you what I thought when he sat down. I thought he was a nut job. Some of you have probably been on the other side of that. You found something, you wrote it up, you did the responsible thing, and took it to the people who could fix it. And you sat across a desk from somebody who'd never heard of you, who didn't want the problem, and who'd made up his or her mind about you in the first 10 seconds. I was that person behind the desk. I was the chief elections officer of the largest state in the country, and he and I did not start out on the same page. His name, as David mentioned, was David Dill, computer science professor at Stanford. He had 1 hour. And here's why I didn't want to hear it. I didn't run for that office to fight against computers. I ran on increasing access and participation. That was my platform. More people voting, minority communities, language access, voters with disabilities, casting a ballot privately and independently like anyone else. Before that, in the legislature, I wrote California's vote-by-mail law because I believed the easier you made it to vote, the better it was for democracy. And the year before David Dill walked in, I co-authored a $200 million bond measure to help California counties buy voting equipment. The measure didn't say what to buy. It was money for modernization, whatever modern turned out to mean. But my name was on it, and I'd stood up in public and told Californians it was progress. So that's the position I was in when David sat down. We were spending the money and telling everyone things were fine. I don't know fully why I ended up going the other way. I'd like to tell you it was character, but it was really because David was extremely well prepared and we didn't treat each other like idiots. Some of you may be wondering how the country ended up with electronic voting machines at all. In 2000, the presidential election came down to Florida, and Florida came down to little pieces of paper that hadn't been punched all the way through, hanging chads. For 36 days, election officials held those up to the light, trying to determine the voters' intent. Congress reacted the way institutions often react to a failure. In 2002, it helped pass the Help America Vote Act, HAVA, and put nearly $4 billion behind getting rid of punch cards. The problem was that notwithstanding their failure, punch cards were paper. So they felt the solution was to get rid of the paper. $4 billion to solve a problem with reading ballots by buying machines that don't produce one. That's where the touchscreens came from. So here's what David told me, and it was simple. Counties were buying machines called DREs, the electronic voting machines. The whole concept is that you touch a screen and the machine writes your choice into memory. That's the entire record. There's no ballot, no anything. So if you want to know whether the count was right, the only thing you can do is ask the machine again, and it will tell you the same thing it told you the first time, whether it's true or not. David wasn't saying the machines had a bug. He was saying they could have one that no one would ever find. No error surfaces, no fraud surfaces. A software defect and a stolen election look identical from the outside, and the outside was all there was. I'd been in and around politics at 25 years at that point, and I'd heard a lot of people telling me the sky was falling. But this, it didn't sound like that. It sounded like a person describing simply how a machine works. A few days later, I created that task force David referenced to dig into the machines. Let me tell you how we built that task force. We put computer scientists on it. We put local election officials on it, the county registrars, the people who actually run elections. We put disability rights advocates on it. 11 diverse members total, and we required them to hold public hearings around the state. I attended 2 of the 4 myself. They reported back in July 2003. 3 things came out of it. First, our so-called independent testing authorities wouldn't answer basic questions from a state task force. Second, the vendors would not hand over the information anyone would need to actually evaluate whether their machines were secure. Third, the task force could not agree on the need for paper. In fact, 8 members refused to call for a voter-verified paper trail. 3 members did. Kim Alexander of the California Voter Foundation, David Dill, and David Jefferson, who graciously introduced me. 3 out of 11. I read that report and the written testimony submitted at every hearing, and I thought about it for a very long time. And I went with the 3, against the majority of the task force, which included several members of my own staff, who didn't think paper was necessary. You know, I didn't come to that instinct on my own. My father served in Congress and in the California legislature. And in the legislature, he was one of 2 members who voted against the internment of Japanese Americans in 1942 when it was ordered by the president. California was asked to implement it. My father was one of 2 of 120. Now, I'm not suggesting that a fight over voting machines belongs anywhere near any scale that matters. It doesn't. But while my dad's vote seems like a no-brainer now, at the time it wasn't. At the time it spoke to who he was and what he believed in, and I was lucky to have a little bit of that passed on to me. That fall, we started hearing that Diebold had installed uncertified software on the machines in Alameda County, one of our counties in California. Software nobody had checked or approved, running in a live election, counting real votes. In November of 2003, as a result, I halted Diebold's certification process, and I ordered an audit of every voting system in the state. To be clear about what we expected, I thought we'd find a problem in a county or 2. But 17 California counties were running Diebold software, and not one of them was running software the state had certified. Here's the part the video didn't cover. All of that was already illegal. California law required the Secretary of State to certify all voting machine software, every version, every patch. That had been the law for years. And the registrar of Los Angeles County, the largest election jurisdiction in the country, told the LA Times that most counties had always been changing software without telling the state. Even major changes, that it was no secret and everybody did it, she said. We discovered that even the Secretary of State's office had not been enforcing certification requirements. No one was following the rules. This is what it all led me to. Later that November, I announced that as of July 2005, no California county could buy a touchscreen machine that didn't produce an accessible paper record the voter could verify. And by July 2006, every machine in the state had to have one. Here's how that was received. I remember it all too painfully well. The Association of County Clerks and Election Officials put out a statement saying I hadn't consulted them, that I'd listen instead, using their words, to a select few academicians, hard for me to pronounce it, I'm a politician, with no election experience. They call the security concerns theoretical and hypothetical doomsday scenarios from people who'd never administered an election, which is, I think, roughly how they would describe many in this room. But I did consult them. County election officials were on the task force. They sat in the hearings. I read what they submitted. What made them angry wasn't that I didn't listen, it's that I didn't agree. In December of 2003, the panel that reviewed voting systems for our office met to receive the audit results. I wasn't in the room. I was upstairs in my office with the audio piped in, doing other work. and listening to vendors telling my staff and others on the panel things that I knew weren't true. The audit was in front of me on my desk. I couldn't take it. I went downstairs and sat at the witness table, the chair where members of the public go to give comment, facing the panel with my back to the room. I said the following: the core of our democracy is the right to vote, and implicit in that right is that your vote is private, that your vote is secure, and that your vote is counted as it was intended when you cast it. That we were at a pivotal moment where all of that was in question, and that it troubles me and it should trouble you. But my message was not for the panel. It was for all the voting machine companies sitting behind me. A few days later, before the March 2004 primary, Diebold wanted a piece of equipment approved in time to use it. We said only on the condition they get it federally certified. And I wanted to know whether that would actually happen in time for the election. So I personally called the federal laboratory reviewing it. Never forget this. One question: will this be finished before the election? They told me they couldn't give me that information because it was proprietary, given their contractual relationship with their client. Their client. These labs were called independent testing authorities. That was the actual name. The integrity of the entire federal election system rested on them, and our legal authority to approve equipment depended on what they said. But they were paid by the vendors whose products they tested. You know, in 2004, 40% of every one of these machines in the United States was in California. Yet we couldn't get a schedule out of them because in their view, we weren't their client. So on the 5th of February, 2004, 4 weeks before the primary, I issued security directives to every county in California. I ordered Diebold to hand over its source code so independent experts could examine it. I ordered paper ballots be made available at all polling places. And I ordered something called parallel monitoring. It worked like this. On election day, randomly selected voting machines would be pulled out of service. Experts would sit down at them under live conditions and cast a scripted set of votes. Then we'd compare what the machine reported against what we knew had gone in. Live testing on live equipment in a real election. All of this was controversial at the time. It was not received as the obvious precaution it should have been. Within days, 10 counties running paperless machines wrote to tell me that I didn't have the authority to issue security directives at all. And 3 days before the primary, 2 county registrars published an opinion piece about people like me. They wrote that what we were doing was dangerous, dishonest, and destructive, and that suggesting local officials didn't care about security was untrue and libelous. That was 2 of our own counties about the chief elections officer of the state on the very eve of an election. Around the same time, the Secretary of State of Georgia called to tell me I was destroying public confidence in American elections. Georgia. Some things don't change. The California primary election, March 2nd, 2004. Some counties simply refused to implement the security measures I'd ordered. And in Alameda and San Diego, 2 of our counties, largest counties, the Diebold machines failed outright. The polls didn't open for hours because Diebold had deployed card encoders that were never adequately tested. Thousands of Californians showed up to vote and couldn't. Many left for the day and never came back. That's when it stopped being an argument. Everything we'd been fighting about for a year, what could happen, what was theoretical, what was a doomsday scenario from people who'd never run an election, it happened to people standing in line before work. Then after the primary, we found out what Diebold had done. with our condition to secure that federal approval. They had gone to the testing lab and sought approval for an entirely different piece of equipment. So we set up a conference call. No Zoom in those days. My senior staff and senior officials at Diebold, a few weeks before the hearing you just watched. And I sat in the room listening in. It wasn't the lying that so outraged me. I was used to that by now with Diebold. It was that they thought it was funny. They were making light to my staff of their violations, and it was so disgraceful, I spoke up. My chief counsel was on that call. He said afterward that I made clear that if it were up to me, the company would never do election business in California again. And he added something I think was exactly right, that they'd made a lot of promises to sell the equipment, and when they couldn't keep them, they decided it was safer to spew falsehoods than to lose the biggest market in the country. 10 days before the hearing you watched at the beginning, our office issued its investigation report. It found that Diebold's aggressive marketing had put touchscreen systems into California counties that were neither tested, nor federally qualified, nor certified by the state, and that Diebold then lied about it to us. We later learned that Diebold's own law firm had warned them that using uncertified software in that primary would violate California law. But they didn't care. They did it anyway. You watched the announcement in the video, but here's what you didn't see. We banned 14,000 machines outright in 4 counties using the TSX, David mentioned, and decertified 10 more counties' machines until they met 23 security conditions. Among them, disclose your source code to the Secretary of State, document your development process, no last-minute modifications, complete chain of custody, and no network connections, not internet, not wireless, not a phone line. I also publicly asked the Attorney General of California to bring criminal and civil action against Diebold. I said at the time that they broke the law, that their conduct was absolutely reprehensible, and that it should never be tolerated from anyone doing business in California. The state eventually collected $2-3 million, should have been much more. And frankly, disappointing to me, the criminal case was never brought. I admit, I came very close to decertifying all the machines permanently. Frankly, that's what I wanted to do. What stopped me was November. It was a presidential year, and I didn't believe there was time to put alternatives in place statewide. I'd spent a year arguing that these machines could disenfranchise voters, and I didn't want to do the same thing. 3 years later, Secretary of State Deborah Bowen ordered a top-down review of voting equipment. She could compel those vendors to hand over their code because it was now a condition of doing business in the state of California. This next one's good. In May of 2004, I went to Washington to testify before the Federal Election Assistance Commission about the national need for changes, including a paper trail. That's when I said the only thing these testing authorities were independent from was election officials, and that the administration and Congress needed to provide the resources so that, and I quote, the EAC can truly be the voice of the voters, not of the vendors. It's also where I had an ironic and unforgettable 2-hour meeting. After speaking before the EAC, I went to a meeting in the Capitol I was asked to attend. I was shown to a conference room, and upon walking into it alone, there were 15 Democratic members of Congress sitting around a table. And for 2 hours, those 15 members of Congress took me apart for creating chaos in a presidential year, for destroying public confidence, for handing a weapon to the other side. The attack was led by the author of the Help America Vote Act. The individual who wrote the law that put the machines out there was telling me that I was the problem. To be clear, I understood what was happening in that room, and it wasn't malice. They'd initiated the largest federal investment in election machinery in American history. They'd put $4 billion behind computerized voting as the future of American democracy. And they'd done it for a decent reason. They watched what happened in Florida, and they never wanted to see that happen again. Now here came a Democratic Secretary of State from the biggest state in the country telling them the cure had a defect worse than the disease. They'd made a mistake they simply couldn't look at yet. I was familiar with that condition. I'd put my name on $200 million of the same idea 18 months earlier for the very same reason. The only difference between them and me is that David Dill got to me first. I'd like to say I walked out of that room unshaken, but I didn't. I spent the flight home wondering whether 15 members of Congress, every county election clerk in California, could be right and I could be wrong. But then came the proof. That same spring in San Diego, there was a second Diebold failure, and this one is worth understanding precisely. It had nothing to do with the touchscreens. It was the absentee ballots, vote by mail, which is paper by definition. Diebold's tabulation software counted over 2,800 ballots wrong. Votes meant for presidential candidate John Kerry were given to Dick Gephardt instead. But we caught it. We caught it because the physical ballots still existed. The routine post-election audit turned up the discrepancy. They recounted by hand against the actual paper, and the numbers were corrected. On the paper side, an error surfaced and got fixed. On the touchscreen side, the identical error would have been invisible because there'd been nothing to count. That's the whole argument, and we've never needed a better one. And in July 2004, the federal court, responding to an earlier restraining order filed against me by some counties and advocates, asserting I had no authority to decertify anything, ruled, stating, and I quote the judge, "The Secretary is therefore not only authorized, but expressly directed to withdraw his approval of any voting system found to be defective or unacceptable," which we had done. By the 24th of August, we ensured every one of those counties had met the 23 conditions. And in November, California ran a presidential election. Same counties, largely the same machines, with all the requirements in place. It went fine. No polls closed for hours. Nobody was turned away. And in January of 2005, our office certified the first voting system in California with an accessible voter-verified paper audit trail. The standards we written the previous June were the first of their kind in the country. 2 years later, a new Secretary of State was sworn in, Deborah Bowen, who'd run on continuing to fix California's voting systems, and who ordered the previously referred to review, top-down review. A great Secretary of State who spoke at this conference just last year, I'm told. In her inaugural address, she generously and very graciously said, "Kevin Shelley had the hard work of evaluating new kinds of voting systems at a very, very early stage. And guess what? It turns out that he was right on a great many issues that had at their core the security and accuracy of the vote. I've never needed anything more than that." Now, let me tell you what this village has won over time because of your collective effort. In 2016, still 1 in 5 American registered voters was voting on a machine with no paper. Today, it's roughly 1 in 80. 98% of the votes cast in the last presidential election were on paper. And as of this past April, all 50 states now have a post-election audit law. As my friend Philip Stark, wherever he is, not RLA yet, but it should be. That's a generational win, and a great deal of it started in rooms like this one with people who had no election experience whatsoever. Now here's what didn't change. In 2004, we said the independent testing labs weren't independent because the voters paid them. There are 2 federally accredited voting system labs in this country today. The vendors still pay them. And the condition we imposed in California in 2004, show us the code, is still not part of federal certification. What was made a condition of doing business in our state 22 years ago is still not a condition of doing business in the United States. This village has been running 10 years, the 10th anniversary. In all that time, the major vendors and manufacturers have never participated. Although, as was mentioned by Jeff earlier, they may be out here. Never sent anyone that we know of. Never handed over a machine. The organizers of this village, as was mentioned, buy their machines on eBay. In 2004, we could compel source code as a condition of doing business in the largest market in America. In 2026, the most important public examination of election equipment in this country is done here, supplied by secondhand purchases off an auction site because the manufacturers won't publicly show up. The bottom line is paper was never really the point. Verification is the point. A record the voter can actually check that is actually the thing that gets counted. Anything short of that is a receipt, and a receipt isn't a safeguard. You know, the theme of this conference is agency, self-determination in how we use technology. Finding the places we can help and choosing to act. A vote is the oldest technology of agency we have. And every argument we've had for 25 years about paper and audits and source code comes down to one simple question. Does the machine do what the person told it to do, and can the person check? That's your question. You ask it every day about everything else. Now I want to close by telling you who was actually on our side. In 2003 and 2004, we were lied to by vendors. We were stonewalled by testing labs, reassured by federal processes that only existed to reassure, attacked by county officials, sued by 4 of our own counties, called dishonest in the newspaper, and taken apart for 2 hours by 15 members of my own party. The people telling me the truth were David Dill, David Jefferson, Bev Harris, Kim Alexander, Avi Rubin, Barbara Simons, Matt Blaze, Brad Friedman, Harry Hursty, and so many others. 2 of them were on the screen at the start of this. 2 of them helped found this village. One is a grandmother who found a corporation's source code sitting on a public server because she thought to look. None of them had ever run an election. That was the entire objection to them. Everything I did in that office, I did standing on their shoulders. They put the steel in my spine, and they are the true heroes. The New York Times ran a piece about me in June of 2004. And in it, somebody had said my problem was that I was an activist. I pled guilty. And I said that never had it been more important to be an activist. That was 22 years ago, and I meant it then. But I'd say it with even more urgency today, because there is right now, as I think we all know, an all-out assault on our democratic system of elections. Not on democracy as an abstraction, but on the machinery of it, on the funding, on the institutions, on the people who actually run elections in this country, and on the very voters themselves. It took David Dill 1 hour to change my mind about something this country had spent billions on. Out of that hour came much of what followed. And eventually 50 states with audit laws and 98% of Americans voting on paper. That started with one person who was prepared getting 1 hour. And my hope is that all of you keep demanding your hour. Thank you.
Sure.
Anyone have any questions for the Secretary?
I'm confused. Do you think that the elections, the way they're being done now, is secure? Are you with the way the system is working and continuing the system, or do you think we should go to all paper, in-person voting?
Well,
Mail-in for
the question is, am I okay with how things are done basically now? It really depends on how they're done in different places because, and I know one can't be partisan here, and I will not be partisan. This is a factual statement. The executive branch does not run elections. Each individual state does, and individual states do it differently. So I think some are more secure than others. I do think it is best to have elections run on paper, but as we know, and 98%, as I said in the last presidential election, were done by paper, but you also still have ballot marking devices that may have some level of vulnerability, and you also have scanners, which are computerized machinery that reads the paper. So I think there's still vulnerabilities, and that's what this village addresses. But those, whatever they may be, those are technical vulnerabilities that can and should be addressed. They're not the same reasons that are being given these days for why these elections are insecure.
How do you think voter ID fits in generally broadly into the issue, into this issue of?
So I'm asked, how do I think voter ID fits in generally and broadly to the issue? It's a very good question. California has no voter ID. Some states do. I don't think, some level of voter ID is the issue particularly. I think the issue is what kind. So, for example, in some states, there were efforts to rule that with a large college population, for example, a student ID, it was challenged in court. Well, that can't be a valid ID. Well, of course it can. It's ridiculous. And in fact, that effort was defeated. In other places, it's the question of what is the basis for securing your ability to vote in the first place when you register to vote. And that's what's frankly a little bit insidious of late with some of the measures being advanced to propose issues like birth certificates, and which many people can't find, don't have, or passports at the level of registration. But I think, I'm desperately trying not to be partisan.
You sound like a government.
I know, I can't help it.
Everything that you have gone through, similar to what's going on now in this country, that you would have not still be a Democrat.
I understand. I can't.
Obviously still are.
I can't help it. I am. But having said that,
They're doing the same exact thing to you that they did to you to what's going on.
okay, well, you answered my question for me. Your question for me. Anyway, I agree.
I would love it if you would just admit that the system is flawed, and in 22 years they've done nothing really. It's the same.
Well, I don't agree that it's the same. I don't agree at all. I think there have been major improvements. And I think there's others. I know Barbara Simons California, I think, has very good systems. So we can talk afterwards if you'd like. Anyway, thank you very much.
I'm afraid